So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arbuthnott. I'm a Human Rights and Officer and Project Coordinator at the Sikh Human Rights Group. Thank you very much for joining Cardiff University's and Sikh Human Rights Group's interactive panel discussion on pluralistic views of the environment and diversity. Today's topic will be discussing addressing climate change with a diversity of cultural and indigenous views. Dr. Jasdevrai, can I please ask you to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that the Sikh Human Rights Group has been doing over the years to promote pluralistic views of the environment and diversity?
Hello, thank you. My name is jasdevrai. I am essentially an otolaryngologist, that's a ENT surgeon. In 1984 and 5, we had a number of cases from Punjab, India, for people who were badly tortured, etc. And I started taking an interest in human rights. And then we set up this organization, Sikh Human Rights Group, to get their cases to the relevant authorities like the UN and in this country, to the Home Office, etc. for asylum. But then our interest widened into many other spheres based on what we think is a pluralistic perspectives coming from a Sikh background. The things we started taking interest in is the World Conference Against Racism, the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, transnational corporations and accountability. We thought that TNCs are too big for states and they need to be accountable at the international level. At the World Conference Against Racism, we promoted the idea that we need to move on from being locked into this debate about racism, anti-racism, and move on to diversity as a norm and a natural aspect of the state and society. Then we took up interest in environmental issues, sustainable development, and one of the things that struck us was that civil society in the West is quite active in the whole environmental climate issues, but civil in many other parts of the world isn't. And we took the view that perhaps it's the language of the international conventions, the United Nations, and the whole climate discourse, which is not talking to them, and they feel slightly de-alienated in the whole discourse, and they're not taking ownership. And that's where we bring a very pluralistic approach to both the environment and diversity. So that's in fact where we are. I myself did a master's in politics as well, so I can brush up on in the social science field as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. Professor Hassan Kaya, could I ask you to briefly introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about the work that you and your colleagues are currently doing and have done in the past in South Africa on promoting indigenous knowledge systems and the importance of diversity?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos. My name is Hassan Kaya. I am the director of the Department of Science and Innovation, the National Research Foundation Center of Excellence in Indigenous Knowledge Systems. It's hub with the University of KwaZulu-Natal here in Durban. It is a partnership of 5 higher education institutions in South Africa. University of KwaZulu-Natal is a hub, University of South Africa, Northwest University, University of Venda, and University of Limpopo. And the 5 form the Center of Excellence in Indigenous Knowledge Systems. As I said, we are funded by the DSI, Department of Science and Innovation, through the National Research Foundation. If you look at also in the context of diversity we're talking about, the 5 institutions are also located in different ecosystems, and also if you follow the apartheid social engineering, you'll find the Northwest University is located in a semi-arid area, which is predominantly Swana speaking. If you look at the University of South Africa, it's mostly in Gauteng, it's in an urban area, it's in Pretoria. If you look at the University of KwaZulu-Natal here, it's also located in Durban, which is predominantly Indian, and also surrounded by the Zulu ethnic group. If you look at Venda and the University of Venda and Limpopo, it's also a diversity of ethnic group. Ecologically, it's also semi-arid. You've got the Vendas, you've got the Pedis, the Shanganis. So the diversity there in terms of culture and the ecosystems is very helpful in terms of research and the exchange of lived experiences. My academic background is in development sociology and international political economy. I did my PhD at the University, Free State University in Germany, Berlin. And also I have a postdoctoral certificate in international agriculture from the Technical University of Berlin. So that's my background.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaya. Professor Arvindpal Mandair, could you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the academic work that you've been doing on cross-cultural studies and Oriental and African studies?
It helps to unmute. Thanks, Carlos. My name is Arvindpal Mandair. It's delighted to see so many people turn out at 5 o'clock today. Yeah, I teach at the University of Michigan in the USA. I was originally trained as a scientist. I did my PhD in chemistry. And then in the 90s, early 90s, I became involved in social activism, got involved with the Sikh human rights group. Dr. Rai was one of the people who recruited me actually to do this kind of stuff. I then found that I was completely unable to talk about anything other than science. So I retrained in the humanities. I took an MA and a PhD again in philosophy, actually in philosophy and religion between Warwick and SOAS. So some of my teaching these days, I teach courses on world philosophies, the study of religions. I specialize in India and obviously in Sikhism. I also teach courses on religion and violence, especially terrorism related stuff. More recently, I've become interested in teaching about consciousness studies. And just this semester, just finished a course on race, religion, and caste in the US and India. It's very, very topical indeed. So that's just a little bit about what I do.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Darryl Macer, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you and your colleagues are currently doing at the UBIOS Ethics Institute?
Okay, thank you very much. So kia ora, or konnichiwa, sadikrap. We're based, UBIOS Ethics Institute means Good Life Ethics Institute. We're based in New Zealand, Christchurch, in Japan, Tsukuba Science City, where I am today, and Bangkok, Thailand. We were established 31 years ago to try and develop ways to understand the processes that people and communities make decisions. There is a great diversity of peoples around the world, and we all balance ethical principles in the way that we come and arrive at these decisions. So when I founded the UBIOS Ethics Institute, we had this intention to provide information and mediate the exchanges between peoples around the world. As part of this evolving process, 10 years ago, also founded the American University of Sovereign Nations, based on San Carlos Apache Nation. And you see behind here the war memorial to commemorate the genocide of the Apache people in Arizona, United States. So we try and bring people together from all disciplines. Personally, I gathered a PhD in molecular biology from Cambridge in the UK, and then have a second doctorate in philosophy from Kumamoto University in Japan. And I've spent much of my life in Japan. For 10 years, I was UNESCO Regional Advisor to Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok in Thailand, before trying to establish a global university to decolonize education. And I think that decolonization is critical. So as a president and professor at American University of Sovereign Nations, we try to develop and celebrate the wisdom of people all around the world so that we can create new forms of dialogue and understanding. And so in that spirit, we really celebrate the fact that we can come together and document and describe this diversity so that in the future, should people attempt colonization again, whether it be through academic endeavors or intellectual monopolies, we can counter that because we know that there are peoples around the world who have different ways of thinking. And even in the same so-called homogeneous cultures, we have diversity of who we are. And this is a reflection of what we are trying to do and what we celebrate in our collaboration with the Sikh Human Rights Group and other partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to begin today's panel discussion by delving into a variety of prominent environmental questions. I'm then going to pass the floor or give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who will ask you a few questions on diversity. So panelists, in your expert opinions, why are Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous people, and traditional knowledge systems so vital to protecting our future biodiversity? And Professor Kaya, if I could ask you to go first, that'd be wonderful. Professor Kaya, can I ask you to mute yourself? Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. I'm sorry, I was muted. I mean, the first thing I want you to realize, or the listener to realize, that a large proportion of the population of the world, they live in the developing regions, including Africa. And I want to emphasize also in the context of this discussion, diversity, Africa is a continent, it's the second largest continent in the world, but people tend to look at it as if it is just a country or whatever. People talk of Africa, talk of Vietnam, talk of South Korea, whatever. Africa is a continent, a large one, with more than 2,000 ethnic groups and languages, diverse ecological systems. So the majority of people, they live in these countries, including the ones who are categorized as indigenous people or communities. And you find that most of these people in their diverse or ecosystems and cultures, they depend on the biodiversity and their cultural diversity as well, because there is also something we need to clarify. Cultural and biodiversity go together. People live in specific ecosystems, and they live in those ecosystems. They develop institutions, belief systems, spiritual, whatever, how to adapt and mitigate the challenges they live in. And so these people who live in those diversity of ecosystems and cultures, they develop particular knowledge systems associated with the areas they live in the ecosystems. So they have become custodians of those knowledge systems, which means now with the population, pollution, climate change, if the natural environment is destroyed, it means also their lives are destroyed. So that's why they're very sensitive about the symbiotic relation between culture and environment. So they are custodians of indigenous knowledge. They are the custodians of cultural and biodiversity. And now as increasingly we realize the importance of preserving the nature and our cultural biodiversity, there is also an increasing realization that we need to work symbiotically and closely with these indigenous communities and people if we want to save the world the way we want it to be. And also, if you also come to sustainable development goals, we are going to discuss later, you'll find that the issue, indigenous communities, they've lived symbiotically with the natural environment. So sustainable development, the way they're articulated by United Nations or whatever, is not something new to them because that's the way they live. Yeah? They're the ones who protect most of the ecosystems and most of the natural diversities across regions and across the world. So this makes them very important because If they disappear, if the environment disappears, it means we can't save the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Macer, could I ask you to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think, you know, we often forget in this, let's say, colonized world that there are people of different views and different traditions that have lived over the time of human diversity in very delicate ways with their own ecosystems, their own human ecosystems, and the broader systems that we have developed. Yet the colonial mindset was often to suppress this and just to say either to suit a particular industrial mindset or to suit a particular military or ideological campaign. So that is perhaps useful to those in power or those who have a certain current ideological basis for exploitation of the environment and exploitation of people and the devaluing of individual rights and individual communities. But if we really respect human rights or diversity or celebrate this planet, we have to include this love of life, this love of respect for others, this love of living together and the discovery that it is to live in this planet. And I think when we do that, we undergo both a personal and a community realization that what we've been missing through not respecting diversity, through not respecting the views of others, and not respecting the views of our neighbor, that we have lost so much. Yet still, I find it quite common that we have this monopoly of visions of what is development. So if we think about the common agreed language of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the International Covenant on Social and Cultural Rights, they start with the statement, we the peoples of the world and we need to recognize self-determination of all people and all communities and their right to economic and social and cultural development. Yet this aspect of this declaration itself was often overlooked and is overlooked by people not allowing people a self-determination, but rather a determination based on those who have a particular ideology or the dominance and power. So if we truly reflect on the meaning of these so-called statements of our universality, they recognize our individuality, our self-determination of each community. So that is quite a remarkable step when we understand diversity. So I think this is the essence of the transformation of our worldview that truly comes with empowerment of ourselves so that we understand this diversity and reflect this wonder that we call the world. And so I think this revolution in terms of empowerment is really critical. So when we look at institutions such as Professor Kaya and the University of KwaZulu-Natal trying to mainstream indigenous knowledge systems throughout every department, we can start to see that in that institution. How can we then trigger the lessons from that institution to come back to former colonial centers of power in Europe and revisit their institutions, celebrating the diversity. And already there was that great diversity. It shouldn't be strange that you have so-called empires of Britain or Germany or France, but these could have built on their diversity to become much greater powers than they have been. But they've often neglected that. So I think this is really a wake-up call for the colonial powers. You know, what have you become except something much lesser than the totality which you could have become? And I think when revisiting, we don't need to occupy. We actually can Mandalize, we can use this term Mandalization, to bring something of wonder from every culture together. So, yeah, you can have a sushi in Paris or London or in Durban, and it will be something different to the culture that it originated in. And so this is sort of the essence, I think, of diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Macer. Professor Mandair, could I put the same question to you?
Yeah, those were very inspiring comments from both Professor Kaya and Professor Macer. I don't have a great deal to add, but there was one source that I was reading which said that there are more than 370 million indigenous people living in 70 countries and 6 continents. Just gives you the scope of what colonial systems have been kind of trouncing and missing out on. Now, these are unique cultures distinct from dominant societies. They have long-standing connections to ancestral lands. The traditions that they come from occupy some common themes, and some of the common themes might be the recognition of community of all life, and Professor Macer mentioned the idea of love as a bonding factor, which is very important. Recognizing that humans are just one member of the community of life, respect for all nature and non-human life, living in harmony with nature as an imperative. And also the fact that their traditions honor interrelationships between all life forms and the earth. And they also, as I see them, they also have their own knowledge systems, which both of the professors have alluded to. These are ways of thinking that cut across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. They're not easily definable in the way that monotheistic or the dominant traditions are. They include insights acquired through direct and long-term experiences. These are extensive, multi-generational observations that have come down over millennia. They've evolved and still are evolving in a living process that's been passed on from one generation to the other. And also from what I understand that, you know, to be spiritual, you also need to be able to cooperate with the environment. So it's impossible to think about environmental work without acknowledging indigenous systems of knowledge and indigenous cultures and peoples. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rai, is there anything that you would like to add?
Hello. Yeah, hello. Yeah, I think a lot of this is covered, and I explained to you how we came, the Sikh Human Rights came to this journey. There was a conference or a series of events being organized at Bangkok by UNESCO, where Darryl Macer was in charge of these, when the Secretary General had set up a team to establish universal ethics of environment. And my position was that as an Indian and particularly as a Sikh, I have an issue with the word universal. It would appear where the church, metaphorically, so church could mean mosque or gurdwara or anybody, I mean religion, established religion, seems to have been phased out of the state power or ended. the United Nations now has taken the business of being the messiah of knowing what is universal for the rest of the humankind. So I am sorry, I have a bit of a difficulty. And Darryl Macer, probably being masochistic, kept on calling me back for that until we published a book, which persuaded the team that that different cultures and civilizations, different perspectives on both the environment and how to take care of it and how to relate to it. I give you again. It's an example we've given. We wrote a book which was persuaded that that perhaps the UN should concentrate on goals rather than defining values for the whole of humanity, because values have been there, and our position was that. It's not the first 20th century is not the first time that human beings have started relating to the environment. They've been going on for centuries and millenniums, and many civilizations have very deep philosophical concepts of what their position, what the human relation is to the environment, to the cosmos, to other society, to the other lifespans in our lives in our world, to animals and things like that. And why don't we start learning from them and ask them to express those? Because one of the things we also realized was that in the whole climate change and the environmental field, Western civil society is very active, but the rest of the world, civil society is not active. The states are active, but they take a more defensive position on what they can, what they should not do, and how they want to manage their economies and what is the least they can do. But there's very little pressure from civil society, let's say in India, Southeast Asia, China, Africa, etc. And perhaps the reason is that the UN is language, choice of language, not choice of language in terms of English, but the way it frames its conventions, etc., simply don't find any empathy with the rest of the world. They find empathy with one civilization, and they don't seem to connect with the rest of the world. And I'll finish by putting this in context of how two very different people from two different areas of the world might see the climate disaster in their lives. You take the average European and tell them the world is going to end in 30 years. Linearity come from traditions which have sort of beginning of the world, end of the world. And so there is a sense of fear of God and now fear of the state. So you can see how the security system, whole issue about security has become very big in the West, because there's a culture of fearing authority. And so fearing that the world will end in 30 years encourages them to take action, take responsibility, try and do something. Now you tell the average Indian who's not had the benefit, or let us say the brainwashing of going to university or educations like that, and you tell him that the world is going to end in 30 years. Now, most Indian tradition already had the idea of many universities. It wasn't discovered by science. It was there in 15th, 16th century. It's always been there, part of many Indian traditions. And they believe in reincarnation. So the Indian is going to say, well, I'm not sure what your problem is, because in 30, my soul is going to go somewhere else. And there are many universities where it could do. If this earth finishes, if it's the karma of this world, there is nothing much I can do, right? And so you see, the language of fear doesn't seem to encourage. And we've seen projects in India that are very successful in the environmental field and sustainability. I've seen some people who've planted 700,000 trees and now planting 550 forests, and then don't talk about the language that you hear at the UN or in the climate change conferences and all that. They talk a more of a spiritual language, which they draw from tradition. And it encourages farmers, where in India, in Punjab, even 1 inch of land, if you take from another farmer, can end up in violent disputes, not forgetting courts. But they quite happily give that land away to plant trees and things like that. So and we feel that there is a need to start being pluralistic. And I'm not blaming anybody. I think what works for one civilization and one culture may not work for other cultures and civilizations. And if we really want to stop this climate disaster, we need to be a bit more pluralistic in our approach and not just have one people. So here I am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. That was extremely insightful. We're now going to move on to our second environmental question of the evening. So panelists, if I could ask you, in your expert opinions, what are the greatest challenges that our global community faces when it comes to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and how can they be overcome? For example, what should ordinary or non-expert members of our global society do when they think newly enacted environmental policies or laws are unethical or unjust? And Professor Kaya, if I could ask you to go first. Sorry, Professor Kaya, could you unmute yourself?
Okay, I said, first of all, I must say that the spirit and the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals is commendable because it combines efforts to eradicate poverty and also promote sustainable development in the poor regions of the world, including Africa here. And also another important aspect compared to the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to be more inclusive, the sense that they combine actors or they mobilize actors from both the developed and the developing countries. But however, the Sustainable Development Goals provide opportunities as well as challenges. And one of among the challenges is that the nations across the world, as Rai was saying, are ecologically and culturally different, with diverse needs, opportunities, threats, and perspectives. So it is very important, it's therefore very important that with these diversity of needs and challenges, there is need to domesticate the Sustainable Development Goals according to the cultural and ecological conditions of particular countries. And that's what is done in most African countries here. We have a big project in Rwanda. In fact, I'm part of another project with the University of Bristol there. I was there in January last year, whereby Rwanda is trying to domesticate the Sustainable Development Goals because the cultural and ecological situations, they are different from other parts of the world, including Africa itself. So you'll find because of the diversity of the Africa as a region and also the countries, ecological and cultural different, the challenges you find in Africa here, which might be different from other regions of the world, you have, for instance, issues of instability, such as conflict within nations, because you find that contrary to what other people say, most of the conflict in Africa within countries themselves, go to Somalia there, go to Nigeria, whatever there. So in a situation where there is no peace but a conflict, it is also difficult to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And also another challenge you find in the context of Africa here as a region is to ensure that sustainable development programs fit local contexts, as I said, culturally and ecologically, instead of universalizing them, just they're all universal. And also there is a problem with the Sustainable Development Goals in the sense that the interlinkages and the interdependencies among the goals and sectors are not very clear. So the tendency of sustainable goal to be articulated as universal, which undermines the cultural and ecological diversity and sometimes the rights of indigenous communities. Because if you look at them, like what Rai was saying in terms of universalization of ethics, ethics are culturally and ecologically different. If you want to tell the Maasai or the people, the Batwa in the Congo forest not to eat monkeys, you must also apply or understand the way they relate to the environment. So the Sustainable Development Goals should not be universalized because sometimes they might go against the cultural and ecological rights of particular people. And also there is an issue of governance, such as political will among the policymakers to transform development programs associated with the Sustainable Development Goals into sustainable long-term practices, which are inclusive and cultural and ecologically specific. So those are some of the issues. And most of the developing countries, including Africa here, African countries, lack the capacity to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of finance, they don't have the financial resources, they don't have the technological resources, the human resources across the sustainable development related sectors. Policy coherence is a problem, the issue of partnerships. That's why I find one of the 17 sustainable development talks the importance of partnerships and the necessary data also for monitoring and accountability of monitoring and evaluation of how sustainable they are. So you find that it becomes a problem of universalizing sustainable development goals. And as I said, the goals and the indicators need also to be very clear. How are the different education related to environment might not be clear, and it's also, as I said, ecologically dependent, how education and good governance is related. So these things also are some of the challenges. So that's why when we meet in a discussion like the platform like this, or the ones we have in Bristol, I mean, we discuss how do we domesticate the sustainable development according to the cultural and ecological context of countries, rather than just universalizing that all the sustainable development goals could be implemented in the same way as the ethics in environmental ethics are being done. So the specificity of the sustainable development goals according to context in those challenges I pointed out, governance, resources, need to be taken into consideration. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaya. That was extremely insightful. Dr. Macer, could I put the same question to you?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. Well, I think the answer is believe in yourself. If you find something that you object to, believe in yourself to express your opinion. And don't believe in a paper degree. Don't believe in some airs and some titles before or after your name, or your age, or your gender, or your race, or your ethnicity. Just believe in yourself. If you think something is wrong, then there's some reason that it may be wrong. It could be wrong for various reasons. So it might be wrong because you may have a wrong mindset. It may be wrong because other people have a wrong mindset. It may be wrong because people don't understand the diversity. And I've found even people in great positions of power may make mistakes and may be quite open. And in fact, the people who are the most interesting intellectually are also often the most humble and most willing to understand themselves. And even if they're not humble, they may be scientifically the most curious. So they may well question what they're doing. I think usually I would approach it methodologically to ask directly to the person rather than embarrassing somebody in public or criticizing somebody as an enemy or like fighting a war. Write to them and ask, hey, I found your idea interesting, but for me and for my tribe and for my group of people, I don't understand. And please correct me if I'm wrong. I really would like to learn. So that attitude of interaction provides an avenue. And if people are really interested in dialogue, and I think these are the partners that we really need to work on, they will then celebrate that questioning. And I found that, I think, in some of the most interesting people. If you confront people or confront organizations, you may bring out the arrogance that they have or a defensive posture. So I think this is the real approach. So sadly, sometimes this world is very confrontational and that mentality is gathered. Also, sometimes we have people stealing intellectually ideas. So you might, for example, think, well, I'm a student at the university. I really disagree. I write to this professor, and then next I find there's no response. But a couple of months later, I find the professor has written a letter to the editor of a journal, which repeats my idea. So sometimes it's interesting to actually copy several people in your email or in your question, and then they, just as a protection mechanism. But generally, I would suggest that you should approach the organization or person in a non-confrontational way, open to learning and being humble. And of course, in our own ontological development of our own understanding, we can develop. So I think this is really the attitude, the wonder. So in my own case, I never imagined I would be, go and live in the United States of America, but I work on Native American land. I work with Native American people, and this is, for me, what America represents. It's breaking the illusion of what the modern hegemony of America is. The same living in England, it was very interesting to me. And I think we have quite a few English people or British people. The fact that many of British colleagues of mine, like me, from former colonies of the British Empire, such as me from New Zealand, is interesting. But we may celebrate this diversity as representation of who we are. And finally, I think sometimes I'm attracted to people who want to be different, yet also recognize our similarity. And in that similarities and differences, we are united. And maybe the final message is, don't be afraid to disagree with yourself. After you learn more about who you are, your identity, your discipline, don't be afraid to say, actually, 10 years ago, I used to think in this way. Or last year I wrote in this way, but actually I've learned my picture was incomplete. That what I proposed was the answer may not be the answer anymore. And the fact that we can only progress with the appropriate humility. Finally, no entity, no organization, or no country is too powerful to take on. In my case, I worked for 9 years directly as a UNESCO diplomat, as a regional advisor, yet I celebrated that diversity. And I think that was being willing to criticize the organization, for me, is a healthy thing. Of course, sometimes it means you must leave the organization because they don't tolerate that criticism. But still, it doesn't mean that the dream of that organization to celebrate diversity is actually still an interesting thing. And I think, well, I was often asked in my role in UNESCO, what is UNESCO? I was asked, in fact, to talk about this almost every day in different countries when I served. And I start, the Charter of the United Nations is we the peoples of the world. It isn't we the organization, it isn't we the nations. It isn't we the International Secretariat. It's the peoples. So you are the United Nations. You don't need to look to the Secretary General or somebody in charge and say, this is the United Nations. You are the United Nations. You are the peoples of the world. We are. And we learn together and we walk together. We sleep together. We talk together. And this is our own future that we inherit together. And it's surely something worth to speak about. So I encourage everyone, surely you must find something. Don't just criticize your government, but actually do something about it. Don't just criticize an organization, but transform it. And this, I think, is why we're celebrating this diversity together. And this may be also the reason some of you joined this seminar in this workshop, or are interested in the project of what we're trying to accomplish in the work. So don't wait for others. Just do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Macer. That was wonderful. So, Professor Mandair, could I put the same question to you?
Yes. That's a difficult line to follow after what Dr. Mason has just said. So I won't talk about the ethics as such, but more as a kind of a naive observer of what's been going on in the US and how people are thinking here about these kind of sustainable goals. So three of the challenges that sort of popped up for me was firstly the challenge of simply, climate stabilization, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here, and keeping up with the goals that have been laid out in previous accords. After Trump's attempted destruction of the whole process, the US is playing catch up at a fairly rapid rate, and it's obviously we're behind, I think, a lot of the other organizations in the world. So first is just keeping up with climate stabilization, keeping up with the goals. Secondly, persuading ordinary people and persuading governments to get on board. And thirdly, to try and also achieve some kind of a balance between activism and business interests. Let me just elaborate on the last two. So staying on course, what I meant was that by convincing, governments and other people, especially those in high income brackets, that these UN goals are not just achievable, but it's also a kind of a win-win proposition, a no-lose proposition. And not least, according to one economist who's spoken about this recently, Richard Pollin, he said that governments need to spend around 3% of their GDP towards renewable and clean energy projects. Those are huge amounts, but they really need to be, people really need to be focused on those kind of agendas and goals. And so staying on course is really, really important, I think. And the third thing was getting this balance between environmental activism and business interests. And again, I'm coming out of the buzz that's here in the US. I'm sure you've all noticed that in the polarized political climate of the past 15 years, it's become commonplace for those on the right of the political spectrum to assign all credit to businesses and to capitalist interests, while those on the left, assign credit to mostly environmental action alone and reject capitalist logic. Noam Chomsky recently argued, well, does this beg the question that is capitalism saving or killing the planet? And I think he's right when he says that, yes, capitalist logic alone will kill the planet, but at the same time, we cannot just bypass business interests either. So the best approach may be to keep the momentum of popular on-the-ground activism going. And I found it really difficult to try and convince people here in the US and certainly students, etc., that this is a worthwhile goal, simply because of the polarization that has kind of happened in the last few years. But at the same time, also to convince larger corporate interests that this is also as much their fight as anything else. For example, in a recent report in one of the newspapers, US newspapers I was reading, it was said that more than 300 corporate leaders are currently asking the Biden administration to double the emissions reductions targets that were set by the Obama administration. That's a quote there. And amongst these 300 corporate organizations are some of the big names like Google, McDonald's, Walmart. So I guess what I'm saying is that the challenge is avoiding an either-or scenario between popular activism as opposed to just business management alone, but to try and combine them somehow. That's a challenge that I see, and it's still something that needs to be resolved. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting. Dr. Rai, could I ask you to conclude?
Mute. The interesting thing is, and we won't take credit for it, but the interesting thing is that the UN has put this as sustainable development goals rather than values and all that sort of thing that it was so obsessed with for the first 30 or 40 years of its existence. So it's something we proposed in our book as well, that the UN should orientate its attention towards goals, for instance, reducing carbon by 2%, etc., and let different cultures and civilizations their own value systems, which will encourage people to achieve those goals. So that's a good thing in a way, but the obstacles are, as all speakers and Darryl Macer has pointed out, the UN starts with we the people. Now the SDG department at the UN is very state-orientated, very state-centric. It really hasn't got the capacity or the infrastructure to network with civil society. Now, who's going to deliver in the end? You can have the best policies and the laws, because this is what's going to happen at COP26. Every country is going to promise on how it's going to, bring sort of a carbon down and make this world survivable for the next 1,000 years with a string of laws and policies and financial incentives. In the end, it's the person on the street. The person on the street thinks, well, I can throw my plastic bag here, I can't be bothered to go walk 100 yards and throw it there, then you haven't really got it. So if people are not buying into this, and they're not, for some reason, feel disenfranchised, they think it's a debate for the corporate sector, for the state sector and all that, then it's simply not going to work in the long run. And this is why one of the problems. And I think the UN needs, it's a very state-centric institution, having called itself we the people, but then it's all about the state. It doesn't really have much room. In fact, the space for civil society has diminished over the years. Although more and more organizations have been included, the space for speaking, engagement has diminished at the United Nations. The states have sort of monopolized and marginalized and pushed them out, which I think it doesn't bode very well for the sustainable development goals to be achieved in the end. It's about poverty, it's about education, it's about environment, it's about gender. I mean, it's not, the state can do everything about gender. If men are not, their attitudes are not going to change, what is the state going to do? Is it going to put all the men in jail or something, silly things like that? And in the end, it's people who have achieve these sustainable development goals. And the second thing is, we are in a strange sort of situation where achieving sustainable development goals, particularly in the environment, has to be profitable. So the emphasis is on corporations and in persuading them that there is profit to be made for the world to survive. I mean, you don't buy an insurance because you think it's profitable at the end of your life. Okay? You don't buy insurance for a house which against fire and things like that because you think it's going to be profitable and reduce your mortgage and things like that. This is common sense, and it's not becoming part of the culture. Again, put it in context. If you say a Muslim, you can argue from morning to evening that eating pork is not really harmful to the health. They won't eat it. That's it, full stop. They don't want to know. You tell a Hindu that eating beef will remove hunger from India. They're interested. They won't eat it. It's part of their culture. Now, why is environment not part of a culture? Why is it just a state subject? Why is it a corporate structure subject? Why have we been disconnected from the environment, whereas many civilizations had that connection with the environment, that this is us, this is our part, this is an extension of us. We need to reorientate the language, etc. And I hope in COP26 they will begin to move towards this, towards a more pluralistic approach to the environment, and not just what the state is going to undertake and what laws it's going to introduce and what economic benefits it's going to introduce and how profitable it will be for the corporate sector to become environmentally friendly, but how people will take charge of it and will claim the world and the environment. So that's where I am. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai, and thank you very much, panelists. I'm now going to give the floor to my colleague, Bethan Walters, who's going to ask you a few questions on diversity-related matters.
Thank you, Carlos. And thank you very much for that, or your views on those questions. They were really insightful. So I'm Bethan Walters. I'm the Human Rights Communications and Media Officer for Sikh Human Rights Group and former Cardiff Uni student. So the area I'm specialising in or specialising in more is on diversity. So we've got two questions that again we'll go through the speakers. So I'll start with this one. So panelists, as your organisations are driven to strive for a more pluralistic approach when it comes to viewing the world, would you agree that the Bangkok Declaration on Human Rights, so a statement that represents or is supposed to represent Asian values and regions, their stance on human rights, is the step in the right direction to achieving a more pluralistic attitude? So I'll start with Dr. Macer.
Thank you. I think one of the most interesting quotes I can think is of a former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who said there are Asian values are universal values. It was rather interesting coming from the Prime Minister of Singapore. Singapore is a very interesting, sort of very controlled country, although it celebrates its ethnic diversity of people of Chinese and Indian and Malay origin, yet it was very controlling. People sometimes asked me, why do I love Thailand as opposed to Singapore? And I love Thailand because of the chaos and the diversity in Thailand as opposed to Singapore, and the fact that we can celebrate a little bit of dirt and a little bit of chaos, and that is what we are as human beings. Yet his statement, I think, is very interesting, and you can say a lot of things about his suppression of diversity, yet the statement is really that universally we have this diversity. We have also a similarity. The broader communitarian approach to making decisions represents this diversity, that each of us are not individuals promoting our only self-determination, but rather individuals who celebrate the diversity of different people. I actually want you to look behind me and then compare to the norm of the Zoom meetings, which is found in the three other speakers, my dear friends. Why do you, especially Jasdev, why do you have books behind you? You think that the world's ideology is in books? It's a very standard academic belief that we actually are empowered by books, but very few people write books. Now, I have shared the chat this wonderful book that Jasdev and others and myself contributed. So we have books, we have to share this diversity, but actually people, this is a celebration of diversity that we have. So when Bethan is doing her work as human rights officer, she's not promoting books, she's promoting human beings, she's promoting diversity. When we're looking at the environment, we're promoting the cactus, the clouds, the flowers, the diversity, the butterflies, everything of nature that works together in an ecosystem. And in fact, ourselves, we have more than 100 species in ourselves as an own ecosystem. There are more non-human cells in the person that appears in front of you or mirror than human cells, yet we call ourselves Homo sapiens. So this diversity is implicit biologically and ideologically. And I think that's really this celebration that we, are working on together of diversity. And it's also the need for us to work together. So you may have also seen this great commercial from Malaysia. It was promoting itself as a country, Malaysia, truly Asia. This used to be a long-running commercial celebrating diversity. And of course, it's very interesting. I did a lot of meetings in Malaysia. It's a very convenient country because they usually they're very open to granting visas. So in the UN, we had many meetings in Malaysia. It's fine unless you happen to be Israeli, in which case you're not recognized as a country. You can't enter unless you're a famous tennis player, which they did allow people to enter. So it's sort of interesting. How do we represent this diversity? So I think declarations attempt to value the diversity, but it sometimes is purely tokenism unless we can actually do it. And I think that was a very interesting avenue. And we're not perfect, and neither are countries that we work on. But we can try to engage and to make the world better. And that's what we're trying to do. So I think that would be the answer for all of us. That our true strength is in this togetherness with people of different judgments and different decisions. And even at yourself, you may make a different decision in the field of bioethics. And we talked about this earlier in the panel. So we may celebrate this diversity and tolerance of people making different choices. And this is really the essence of who we are as living beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Macer. That's brilliant. Professor Kaya, would you like to go next and answer the question? You're on mute in case.
Thank you very much, Bethan. You know, when you gave me that question, I thought the right person to answer that one was Darryl, because he knows more of those dynamics of Southeast Asia, including Thailand and ourselves. But the only thing when I was going through the declaration was that its importance is the fact that it highlights the need for self-determination as a means of mitigating the historical marginalization of indigenous communities, especially the significance of advancing the diversity of and the complementarity and the democracy of knowledge systems, including that of indigenous communities in the Asia-Pacific region. I think this is one of the most important things I can say. Can't say much about the Bangkok Declaration, except that it recognizes that right of indigenous peoples to self-determination as people with their own distinctive cultures, knowledge systems, including indigenous languages. I think that is what I can say. Most of the issues that they pointed them already.
Thank you very much, and that was so great. Thank you. And finally, Dr. Rai, would you like to add your opinion or answer? Oh, Dr. Rai, would you like to? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, the Bangkok Declaration is quite interesting in that it doesn't really, I don't think it introduces an element of diversity or pluralist, but it's interesting dynamics between hegemony, a political dominance, and states trying to counter that dominance with the hegemony of a new state order. Okay, so it's very much a state again led by Asian states, and it's interesting if you look at some of the paragraphs. It reminds me of a conversation I had with an Indian diplomat in the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. Many of the Asian countries and some African countries were spending days arguing, bickering over small words and I asked the Indian chap, why are you so obsessed with these small bits, or why is it bothering you so much? He said, well, when in the first 20, 30 years, we took it for granted. We were really excited about human rights and things like that. And then we found out within 20, 30 years that the West was using the UDHR to punish us. Okay? The West was going to wars, so America was going to wars, the Britain was going to wars, but when any of these developing countries they were violating human rights anyway, they were still coming to terms with the idea of the state, and it was being highlighted at the UN left, right, and center. And he said, so we signed up to that, and now we realize that we have to be very careful how we sign up to every little word and every little comma and things like that. And so you see nowadays when you try to get a resolution through the UN, it can take days and days and days to get it through, because they just spend days on small words. Now the Bangkok Declaration is in a way typical of their dynamics. Okay, it goes on. It starts off with the saying that human rights and fundamental freedom has to be rightly placed within the context of international cooperation. All right. Darryl will remember this recently at Geneva. China was going on about human rights as in the context of international cooperation, and all the Western countries and Europe lined up saying, no, it's got nothing to do with international cooperation. It is, well, in a way, it's the Holy Grail or the new 10 Commandments or whatever. It is universal declaration and full stop. So you have to observe it. What China was trying to say was that coming from a different perspective, that there may be some violations, but we have to look at trade and things like that. I mean, China was not also right in its sense. So you see, it's within the context of international corporations is a cover for that. Then it goes on to say progress made in the codification of human rights instruments, establishment of international human rights, while expressing concern that these mechanisms relate mainly to one category of rights. So I don't know what they said. They are indicating that it's all very well going on about human rights. What about the right to development? And they wanted the focus at the UN to be taken away from human rights and shifted to focus on development. So and with development, they wanted to say, well, look, our people are poor, we have poverty, we are underdeveloped, and if human rights get violated, so what? And it goes on to say later on that international would say funds and things like that should not depend on human rights. That development should be a right per se. So there was a lot of emphasis and shift towards development by the state. So it doesn't bring in another aspect to it. Then and then it quite rightly hit there. Application of double standards in the implementation of human rights and its politicization. That's what they were driving at. That human rights are being politicized by the West to put developing countries down. And then I was saying that it should be through not confrontation, but or imposition of incompatible values. Now, this is where the values they are trying to say, but they haven't. Now, this is where I take sort of a slide. I don't quite agree with this. The Asian countries, they keep on saying they have different values, but they haven't codified these values in terms of where is the what values, how do they codify for the dignity of the individual or society or all that sort of thing? Okay? In the end, it seems to be all related to the individual and the state. The dimension that is missing from all this is one of the things about Asian cultures is it's a trilogy. It's the king or the monarch, or now we call it the state, society, the family, community, and the individual. So they work in a triangle, as a harmony of triangle. They don't bring, and they keep on saying in their defense that this is a society and our family and our values, but they don't bring them into the debate or in the Bangkok Human Rights Declaration. And then they go on to about the urgent need to democratize the United Nations system. Obviously, that's a dig at the 5 members, and then they go on about self-determination. They say they frame self-determination as a decolonization process, but not neo-decolonization process. Okay, so countries like India, etc., they don't want any any discussion on self-determination of people within, let's say, Kashmir or other areas, or in China for Uyghurs, etc. The only self-determination they want is decolonization. So I'm not sure whether it brings a different perspective. It doesn't bring a pluralistic, it just brings the interest of the Asian states and them fighting off what they think is a political dominance of the West, which they succeeded in many ways, that you find there is very little room for human rights discussions at the UN now. So yeah. So it's an opportunity that went missing. Whether you look at the Cairo Declaration or they're basically replications of the UDHR with a bit thrown here, a bit thrown there, but nothing significantly that tells you, oh, there's another worldview there. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. No, that was some really interesting and so I'll move on to the yeah, thank you. So I'll move on to the second question now. And touching on kind of what we just spoke about, actually, so panelists, given the people who have attended today has been taught from such an early age, and how it has led to the universal concept of the West is best, and fundamentally the cause of ongoing issues surrounding diversity, what would you advise students and educational institutions who want to challenge this mindset? So I'll start with Professor Mandair. You're on mute.
Okay, thank you, Bethan. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that I've actually done in academia since the mid-90s has really been to try and get out of exactly this mindset. And just give you an example, what I wanted to study was my own tradition, Sikhism, in relation to India, etc. And as I started digging into it in the early 90s, I realized that there was already a kind of a knowledge block in place that prevented me from going further and really expressing what the original teachings, the texts, the scriptures were trying to say. Part of that was the imposition of sort of colonial translations, etc. So I started to delve into this in the in the mid-90s and realized that prior to British colonization, Indian systems already had their own ways of putting multiplicity first at the center of their sort of knowledge systems, etc. And just prior to British colonization becoming absolutely hegemonic in India, you could see, for example, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and others all going to the same shrines, borrowing each other's ideas. The system of language was completely fluid and evolving naturally. And once the British had set up the systems of governance and education, suddenly the languages start to become solidified along lines of identity. So this is a long story. I'll cut it very short because I don't have much time. But I've been sort of figuring out ways to actually get to original sources, and I found out that the very institutions that were training me were also blocking my progress as well. And the US system, the UK system of getting tenure is terrible because you have to work within a certain knowledge system. And very often I've seen people who are expressing incredibly fertile ideas just simply be shunted out. And it really comes down to this idea that there is no pluralism there. There was no pluralism in the knowledge system. The knowledge system itself holds sovereignty over everything. And, you know, this is an interesting fact that, that I think you learn after like being in these institutions for decades. The West exercised political sovereignty, but there is something else called epistemic sovereignty, which is actually a kind of a parent of political sovereignty. So before there is political sovereignty, you have to have epistemic sovereignty, and that's crucial. And that is this hidden kind of system within the knowledge system that I think many others, and I'm sure Darryl, you've gone through this as well, that you have to kind of break through. Things are improving now, but painfully slowly. So to students, what would I advise you to do? If you want to be an activist in this area and to go on and study, first of all, change your own mindset. I was trained in a philosophy department, and that's probably the worst place in many ways. They just see systems, they set the rules for how you're supposed to think. And the first rule is that there are no other philosophies outside of, you know, Western philosophies, or at least they're simply mimicking or borrowing from what is originally said in the Western systems. So first thing, change your mindset so that you can automatically affirm multiplicity and pluralism in your thinking. You know, the multiplicity of knowledge, systems, bodies, experiences, traditions, conceptual practices from around the world. And don't let anybody, you know, tell you that this is philosophy, this is the way you should think, etc., etc. When somebody says thought or philosophy in the singular, your first step should be to push back and displace the singular with multiplicity itself. And on a more practical level, you know, try to find courses, if you can, on world philosophies. We're still in the very early stages of decolonizing curricula. The process has really just begun. There's been an awful amount of pushback in the past 4 or 5 years. But I'm reasonably hopeful that with continued activism within academia and also by students themselves, we will kind of get to a more interesting place than we have been in the last 25 or 30 years. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully events like this will help. Okay, so next, if Dr. Macer would like to answer the question. If you need me to repeat it, I will, but I've popped it in the comments.
Yeah, thank you, Bethan. That was good. Yeah, and well, thanks, Arvindpal. I think you've described exactly this academic mentality and disciplinary mentality that most institutions are set up to convey and to perpetuate. So we really have to break this mold. How do you do this? As the question is framed, really it is a challenge for students. If you're a perpetual student, such as myself, we're lucky. My comment about books, we'll put this in context. So after I finished my doctorate in molecular biology, actually before I'd started that, I said I wanted to work in the field of bioethics and the bridge between science and society. Bioethics is a love of life to me. Fortunately to me in Cambridge at that time, there was nobody doing bioethics. So I was left to my own devices and went to the university library to celebrate millions, and there are millions of books. And it's a great repository, and most of his books were never opened. And I confirmed this fact about these books in recent times, in the last 6 or 7 years. When revisiting those libraries and spending a week, I went to new sections, my field of indigenous studies or learning about Native Americans. And I found, if I search for Apache, there's like 500 books on Apaches. Some of these books were 100 years old. And I'm afraid that for most of these books, I apparently was the first person to ever open these books, even though they'd been sitting on the bookshelves, lost in the shelves in this library for 100 years. And certainly I was the first person to take most of these books out of a library. Why did I take them out? There was so much to learn. So using this modern device, the invisible iPhone, you can't portray in the, and not to promote one brand. I just spent a week taking tens of thousands of photographs of pages of books so that I had time when I go back to my home or living under a tree or wherever I want to read the book, to read it. This great repository of knowledge is there. And many years ago, there was an older, very interesting story of Harvard Law School called The Paper Chase. It's a very interesting old serial. And it was also explaining what law school is and saying, well, it's actually just reading papers and papers. And of course, having discussions about this. And this can be creative if you use in the right way. The same as reading philosophy can be great, or reading whatever you do it well and read and understand. But this, I think, is one approach. About 10 years ago, I had the pleasure to get in an elevator in Malaysia and meet a dear colleague who's on the Zoom screen next to me, Hassan Kaya. We got on the elevator and we simply said hello and let's work together, and we've been doing so ever since. We had no prejudice about where we came from or who we were or what we'd studied. We just thought it was a good idea to work together. And in decolonization, you have often these fields in African or Asian universities, such as African studies or Asian studies, as programs of knowledge that everything's integrated, but in the regional sense. I found that quite interesting. And these meetings, in fact, on decolonization of universities, I was delegated by UNESCO to go along to these meetings to represent UNESCO. And at first meetings, I asked the delegates, well, I'm meant to represent UNESCO, and they knew something about me. What's the message I should take to UNESCO? And in both the meetings I attended, the message was quite simple. We'll just shut it down. We don't need UNESCO anymore. It doesn't represent people. So I found that, of course, interesting, because I'm quite tolerant to different views. And I also had perhaps had the same views, even though I was representing that organization. So be prepared to reform institutions to create something totally different. However, if you're a student or if you need to pay your bills, you have to work in the system and work in the system that you need. If that works on the epistemology of colonial science or philosophy or whatever it may be, well, we celebrate that diversity. There's wisdom in every field. There's wisdom in every culture. But you can also find, if you dig deeply, you can find that diversity. Take another example from genetic engineering, which many people question. In the past, genetic engineers, what we would do is find an interesting gene sequence to transfer into another organism and give it a new property. Let's say you want to make a salt-tolerant crop that can grow in the ground that is becoming salty because of climate change. Okay, well, we can find that, but actually, if we go back in genes, because we all share the same genes, you can find the same gene or the pseudogene, the same DNA in every organism. So actually, in the end, you can rediscover yourself as a maize. You can find it in the maize, you can find it in the rice, you can find it in the carrot, and you can find in the fruit fly, or you can find in a human being. So we actually have this diversity implicit in us. So in the same way that diversity of knowledge or thinking, you can find in every philosophical, traditional epistemology. And being able to reflect on our own traditions and the way that's taught and our own disciplines, then I think we can celebrate that actually we have learned a lot. So this, I think, is really the great power of what we can learn from listening to ourselves and to others. And this is really, I think, also what we want to accomplish in these meetings in the UN, that they need to listen to themselves, to throw away the books, to throw away this so-called wisdom of that system, and look inside and find themselves in a new light. And for any professors on the call, you should introduce yourself as a student of life, not as a professor. We are celebrating wisdom, and that's what we're really doing. That's what knowledge is. And I have a very lucky and privileged position to be able to be a student every day. It may not make you rich in terms of money, but it makes you rich in terms of knowledge, and perhaps we can provide a little bit of wisdom that might help reach these goals that we want to accomplish together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really nicely put. So yeah, speaking of Hassan Kaya, Professor Kaya, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bethan. I think from my own experience here in Africa, we must look at the whole issue of power relations in the global knowledge economy, in the sense that, for instance, in our case here in Africa, you find that because of our history of slavery, colonialism, and other forms of imperialism, African cultures and associated knowledge systems, even forms of education, were totally marginalized. If you look at the global knowledge economy, there is a hierarchy of knowledge systems. You find Western knowledge is dominant. It's the only standard of education. The other systems, including indigenous languages, have been marginalized. Indigenous languages, even language generally, the West look at languages as just tools of communication rather than the depositories of knowledge. And that's what, in our case here, we have a big project across the continent. In fact, I wanted to share with you guys, I think I shared with you and Carlos, that we have started a consortium of African Indigenous, African Institute in Indigenous Knowledge Systems here, which combines almost 20 higher education institutions. We had a visual ceremony on the 29th of January. The aim is to create a new paradigm in the knowledge production, in the revision, we call it ourselves a revision of the knowledge cycle. Whereas the demarcating knowledge into production, management, and protection, that in real life, as we've been living here in Africa and other indigenous communities, those things are integrated. It's holistic. You don't live today biology, tomorrow chemistry, the other. Life is holistic. As Darryl was saying that he's interested in Thailand because life is messy. That chaos there is sometimes more interesting than the other things. So that the holistic way in which African education system is structured, it was totally marginalized by Western knowledge. And most of the students, they also realized the disjuncture between learning and living, in the sense that the life they experience in daily life at home, in the community, is totally different from the life in the classroom. The life they experience, which they need everyday life as the children of farmers, fishermen, whatever they are, is different from, is less expensive, more enjoyable than the expensive life they have to pay in higher education institution, getting a paper, a certificate, which when you come out, you don't even, nobody wants it. So they need a new kind of mindset, a new type of education, which removes the disjuncture between learning and living. And that's why here, as part and parcel of our indigenous knowledge promotion and knowledge revision knowledge cycle, we try to bring the community into the lab and the lab into the community. We take traditional healers, bring them in medical school to see how knowledge is produced there. And our medical students also come in the community working with traditional birth attendants. The whole thing is to decolonize the Western dominated knowledge system, which creates a disjuncture between life and living, which we created or was created by colonization. And most of the students now, they're questioning that type of education because it makes life a bit contradictory, right? What I learn, what I get a certificate there, but when I go outside the university after 10, 20 years, I find myself totally alienated. The things I used to do in the community, I know all the names of birds and animals, I know how to cultivate, but when the higher, the more Western education you get, the more you are alienated from your own communities. So that's why most students, especially in South Africa, if you listen to the mass media, whatever, there's a lot of activism among students, questioning free education because they don't want to pay education which is not relevant to daily life. So the question of decolonization is very important in the sense that it's part of a new paradigm shift to try to create, to demand a type of education which is complementary, which is democratic, which is in symbiotic relationship with the everyday life. I think I stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really well put. Finally, jasdevrai or Dr. Rai, would you like to add anything to that question?
Yeah, I think the notion West is best. I think it. We can't blame the West for it. It was part of the colonization process. It's part of every imperialist, whether you look at the Romans or whether you look at kingdoms in India or China, etc. in the past. Whoever rules wants to try and marginalize the communities by changing their culture or bringing their own knowledge system as superior. But now the rest of the world is free. So nobody's asking it to take, knowledge produced in, let's say, we are here in Cardiff University or Oxford University or Harvard University. The problem is most of the people they lead to rule these countries go to Ivy League universities in America or Oxbridge here, and nothing changes. They can go rant on about the West is best, but they are the one who are perpetuating it. And and there is it's up to them to find the counter argument. I mean, I think take the whole idea of the state, the nation state. John Bruley, I think, who may still be at LSE, in the book "When is the Nation?" wrote brilliantly that the nation state is a European evolution. It is there as an evolution of European society to a certain political problem. What's it got to do with India or China, etc.? Why have they formed states copying that? So if you're going to form the state in terms of the Hobbesian model, then you are going to have the whole theory of human rights and the theory of everything else that constitutes the state. And then you can't say, well, we are victims of West is best, because you have copied the system and transplanted it. If you look at some of the nationalism, like say the Muslim Brotherhood or Hindutva in India or etc., they're all born in 1920s. They're all sort of counter-colonial movements which use the colonial language, and they use the language of 19th century European nationalism and just put the word Hindu or Muslim or things like that and bring a bit of a culture or historical background. But the context of those ideas, we take Hindutva or you take Muslim Brotherhood, is the same. It doesn't really bring a new conceptual framework to that. You take China, for instance, goes on about Confucianism. Well, where is the concept of the state in Confucius theory? So the state, as Bruley says, nation state is a European evolution. Have you come up with a different idea of the state? Have you come up with different concepts of the state? And I think this is what I do admire Darryl Macer's university, because he is trying to break the mold. I don't think his university is given credit by the rest of the Ivy League universities in America. They probably think this is a Shamam or something like that university. But is bringing the wisdoms and trying to look at the frameworks of those and a different epistemology of knowledge, etc., and seeing how we can look at things. So, yeah, best is West is not perpetuated by the West anymore. It's been perpetuated by the very people who complain about it. And they are the people who need to break the mold. They are free now. They've got their countries, and they need to start bringing the new concepts into the world. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of you on commenting on both of those. So we're going to open the floor now, if that's the right terminology, and answer some questions from the audience. So if you don't want to speak, you can put them into the comments, but just let me know and I will unmute you. Yeah, just give you a few minutes if you want to come up with any questions. And if you've got a particular panelist you want to ask a question to. I think there was a question halfway through by Amy, if everyone can see that in the comments. Any questions? I've got one who's messaged me. So this is to whoever wants to answer on the panelists, but so what would you like to see from the Sikh Human Rights Group and them contributing at COP26?
Right. I think all this is the interesting thing is all the panelists are members of the Sikh Human Rights Group. Anyway, it's a testimony to our pluralist approach that they feel quite comfortable to be part of this and don't see it as some sort of a community group or religious group or things like that. It's what we want to see in COP26 is what we introduced in the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. We took the slogan that racial parity is meaningless without culture parity. What the world or the UN is saying is your color is okay, but your culture is not okay. So you must bring culture parity along with racial parity. And it became very much a big part of the World Conference Against Racism. So, I mean, we can take pat on our back and say credit for that. Then we moved on. We have been pushing this idea of the Declaration on Diversity. Okay? In COP26, we'd like to see something similar, that a plural approach to the climate change, not just to bring in people from different colors and races on the board of the climate change committee and things like that, but speaking the same language. Let's bring the context of their background, their cultures, and etc., and how they relate to the environment and how they want to deal with the climate change. And I think a more pluralistic approach, because what has happened is the last 40 years, we are at the brink of disaster. We have failed, talking in one language, one approach, one orientation, and it's not working. Time to start thinking a bit more laterally, parallel, and pluralistically.
Thank you very much. That was great. Would anyone else like to contribute to kind of what you'd like Sikh Human Rights Group to contribute to at COP26? If not, we can go on to another question.
Yeah, okay. Should I come in or what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I must say I had the privilege of attending most of the COPs except the one in Poland. I mean, there are two things I would like to emphasize for us in the COP26. One, there's been a tendency in most of the COPs, except in the side events done by indigenous communities and the other NGO, to put more emphasis. They put more emphasis on the issue of mitigation rather than the issue of adaptation, whereby in cases where we attended the side events of the indigenous communities, I mean, our emphasis was more in articulating that these indigenous communities are not just vulnerable. they've got their own knowledge systems which they use to survive. And these can also contribute to especially in their diversity there is a virtue, because there's also one problem whereby you find colonization and the hegemony of Western knowledge. They tended to look at diversity here in South Africa in particular because of the apartheid system. That's why people were divided not only in terms of race, but also that's what most people don't understand. South Africa is not just divided in terms of race, but also in terms of ethnicity. It's an issue which most people don't talk about. But we are looking at diversity now. That's why we started here a kind of an initiative called the Triple Heritage, whereby if you look at South Africa is a country of people representing 3 regions of the world: Asia, Africa, and Europe. And Europe is just, we also diversity. You've got the Italians, the Germans, whatever, within the Germans. So we're looking at diversity as a virtue, in the sense that when you bring different people from different cultures and different knowledge systems come together in platforms like this, engaging in multi transmissional way in looking for sustainable solutions to global challenges, including climate change. And that is one aspect you find in most COPs, with the exception of the side events, which is not propagated in the big meetings there. One, so those 2 things must be emphasized in the COP26. How do we make adaptation as an important aspect of these discussions? And there's another important aspect: how do we bring the diversity of knowledge systems in the global pool of knowledge to seek or to come up with sustainable solutions to climate change, not just mitigation, but with an emphasis on how people, the majority of people in the global society who live in the developing countries, including the indigenous communities and people there, mitigate or adapt to climate change. Those things are not discussed. The only issue is just mitigation and how big companies can make money or lose money. This should not be the agenda.
Thank you. That was that was great, and fingers crossed that is what happens. So just one more question that we'll ask, and then if anyone does want questions that they think of later on, you can email us or message us over social media. But so obviously Sikh Human Rights Group has a UN consultative status, so it allows us to kind of go to UN conferences and speak there. But again, to any of the speakers, but what would you recommend NGOs without a voice at the United Nations or charities who are tackling issues surrounding the environment or diversity to start lobbying for change? Would it be to collaborate with organizations such as ourselves who do have that voice at the United Nations, or are there other kind of recommendations for them? To anyone who wants to answer.
If I can start, I think there's a space for every organization and every individual. In fact, one of my network of dear colleagues, his name is Anwar Naseem. He's a former secretary of the Pakistan Academy of Science. And he's promoted and written books on what he calls NGIs. NGIs are non-government individuals. And in fact, many NGOs are the passion of an NGI, a non-government individual who wants to make a change and therefore establishes a non-government organization with similarly minded people. So there's a space for this diversity. And in fact, in this whole subject of diversity, it's great to have hundreds or thousands of NGOs or civil society organizations to explore. And many will take different avenues. Some will be out of the mainstream so much that in fact they could not get registered in the UN because that would be counter to what they see as their values, in which case they may want to join on to other similarly minded NGOs or get the forum. And I think people should approach JASDEV and colleagues and in Sikh Human Rights Group and find that we're very open to sharing and celebrating this diversity and working together, because in fact to make a substantial change, it is an advantage to have people and groups working together with combined power. And that's, in a sense, a message of how we can accomplish a change. And then there will be organizations which will be important to have consultative status. And unfortunately, as we also see, if you've attended UN meetings, and in fact, Jasdev was referring to this as well earlier, countries which are all promoting their own interests, and there are many pseudo NGOs who are actually government organizations who are meant to be non-government organizations, but actually promoting particular government lines, whether it be any country has these and supports these. And think about where you are, your identity. Some are pro-science, some are anti-science, some are pro-colonization, some are anti-colonization. All of these things are very critical. And I think that is the celebration of who we are. So if you are an ostrich and put your head in the sand, unfortunately, you can speak to the sand, but you're not going to get your views shared very much. And don't be hesitant, share out, speak, and find similarly minded organizations or those who are happy to listen to you. And you'll find many people are happy to listen. And I think this great forum of bringing peoples together is really what we're trying to work together. There are, of course, organizations, civil society organizations, who want to promote monopolies of knowledge or their own products or their own agenda. But we fortunately celebrate diversity, and there are many I don't agree with their views, but I celebrate their existence, because only through this diversity can we really learn together. And I think that's the great thing that we are trying to do. So please, and for students, or that if you think, well, I have a different idea, then just try. You just create your own NGO, create it, work together, move from a student circle or a student club or a hobby to a passion, and celebrate this diversity or creativity. That's many of the interesting religions in the world think about what's the image of people, and I think this image is the creativity. That is the great thing we can celebrate. So yes, if you want to have what you think is a crazy idea, then discuss it, share it, and maybe it will not be so crazy. Maybe it will actually transform who we are.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. I'll pass on now to my colleague Carlos, and then after he's spoken, I'll go over the internship if anyone is there and is hanging on for that. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bethan. I just wanted to take a moment to thank our panelists for appearing today. I'm sure you have extremely busy schedules, so it is very much appreciated. I think we all found it extremely enlightening and thought-provoking, so thank you very much for that. For more information on today's panelists, who are affiliate members of the Sikh Human Rights Group, please visit our website, which is www.shrg.net, or alternatively, you can visit our Instagram account, which is SHRG_net. Thank you very much to everyone who attended today's event. I've been Class Arbuthnott, and I believe that concludes everything. But if you are here to learn more about our summer internship program, please stick around and we'll delve into it in a